Hello, everyone. This is part two. And in this lecture, we're looking at additional epidemiologic study designs. Now, the purpose of each week that we talk about different research designs are to help inform you and to get you thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of different studies. Because as you are critiquing your literature and as you're writing things up, this is going to be important for you when it comes to understanding the state of the knowledge related to your PICO and to help you draw conclusions. This week, obviously, we are looking at epidemiologic study designs. We're looking at risk. We're looking at risk, exploring injury rates, those measures of frequency, or not necessarily injury rates, but just rates in general, those measures of frequency, and risk to understand how much more likely somebody is of developing a disease based upon different risk factors. My whole goal is that as you come across papers that may be of interest, that you understand the information so that way you can add things to your introduction section, or it can help inform some of the writing in your discussion section. I think the majority of you aren't doing things that involve studies looking at risk or epidemiology. But again, you may be able to utilize information. This particular slide here demonstrates the types of epidemiologic studies. Categories there are the observational studies and the experimental studies, and we'll explore many of these. Another way of appreciating the spectrum of research is to break things down as shown here. There is a qualitative side and a quantitative. In this class, we aren't going to be exploring the qualitative side, not to say that qualitative may not be important for informing some of your writing. Qualitative for me is like a foreign language. It's something I've not explored before. I know it's there. I know it has value, but it is, again, something I just need to take more time to learn. We're obviously going to be spending the majority of our time quantitatively. Under the quantitative side, there's the non-experimental and the experimental. You'll see under the non-experimental, there's the descriptive and the observational epi. Under experimental, you can also have epi as a component of those types of studies. So we're going to discuss all of that here. Again, here's that overview, the observational side of things and the experimental side of things. This is just a different way of looking at the spectrum of research here within the context of epidemiologic studies. Now looking at observational studies, in an observational study, the investigator does not intervene. The investigator allows nature to take its course. And if I had this PowerPoint running in play mode, you would see this individual trying to run backwards on a treadmill. As a researcher, I would just want to see what happens. If I was an employee, I would tell him to stop because I don't want him to get hurt. And you'll see if you were to play this, what the outcome is. But again, in an observational study, the investigator is not intervening. The investigator is just trying to let nature take its course. And you're going to come up with descriptive information and also analytical information, depending upon what type of study design you're using. A descriptive observational study is limited to a description of the occurrence of disease in a population. So this is often that first step where we're looking at different rates. Analytical, this is where you're analyzing relationships between health status and other variables. For the descriptive type of study, again, it's limited to the description of the occurrence of disease or injury in a population. Most studies are analytical in nature. Often, descriptive stats will be found in analytical studies. But an example here from my world, looking at kind of sports injuries, this is descriptive. This is just looking at the injury rates based upon level of competition and what part of season the athlete is in. There is no comparison between seasons, so we don't have an idea if the rates are any different statistically or not. There is not any type of analysis along those lines. We don't know if people in the Division 1 levels different than the Division 2 levels, etc. So this is a descriptive example. Here is another descriptive epi example. This is a case series published in 1981 in the New England Journal of Medicine. This case series described patients with a rare form of pneumonia. It was one of the first papers that explored the disease that was later known as AIDS. And so this is a way that providers can communicate research findings, that description of disease. There was no effort made in this study to attribute how the disease was spread or who could potentially be at risk. Descriptive studies, the first step in epidemiologic investigations, makes no attempt to analyze links between exposure and effect. You're going to see these things as mortality rates, maternal death rates, injury rates, and so forth. There may be an examination based upon age, sex, or ethnicity. Here's a descriptive study example. Maternal mortality in Sweden since the mid-18th century. We see a very positive downward trend in maternal deaths over time, but we also see some interesting spikes. Like, why did it drop here around 1850 but then spike back up? What was going on? These types of observations would potentially inspire researchers to see what was occurring, because one, if there were things that could be identified as risk factors, famine, war, things like that, could you then identify how changing those factors led to improvements? Or was there potentially a new virus that occurred during this time period, and then treatment for that virus helped to return this normal downward trend? So it allows one to speculate causes, and it can contribute to future research. Another similar descriptive type of study here, where it's illustrating a certain death rate per 100,000 people, heart disease, men aged 30 years or more, and we see around the 70s, mid-70s, that we start to see a decline. What can you speculate? Well, could it be that maybe there were changes in understanding of smoking? Could it be that there were new drugs or new surgical procedures that came about that helped this? Understanding of diet and nutrition. So we see that over time, these Western countries, they got down to the level where Brazil always kind of had been. So you can make comparisons potentially. And then you might be able to look and go, wow, why is the Russian Federation up here? What is different in that country versus these countries? Now let's look at ecological studies. These are also known as correlational studies. These are useful for generating hypotheses. In an ecological study, the unit of analysis are groups of people rather than individuals. So this example comes from an epidemiologic textbook I've got. The example is, what is the relationship between average sales of an anti-asthma drug and the occurrence of an unusually high number of asthma-related deaths? So, for this observation, you would need to test by controlling for potential confounders to exclude the possibility of other characteristics. You might be able to go, okay, is there something wrong with this anti-asthma drug? Why is it not working? So it starts to, it's not cause and effect per se, but you see that there is a potential relationship between the sales of that drug and higher number of deaths occurring. And like we said in the part 1 lecture, correlational studies, not strong for causality, but they start to get us thinking about things. Ecological studies can also be done by comparing populations in different places at the same time or in a time series, or by comparing the same population at one place at different times. Here's a time series example, ecological study, deaths in France during the 2003 heat wave. What we see is there was a correlation between increasing temperatures and increasing numbers of deaths. So we're able to see a number of excess deaths per day based upon temperature changes. Ecological studies are simple to conduct, difficult to interpret, seldom possible to examine directly the potential explanations for the findings. Often these studies rely on data collected for other purposes. Unit of analysis is the group, so the link between exposure and effect at the individual level cannot be made. The bias or the ecological fallacy is or will results if there's inappropriate conclusions drawn on the basis of the data. Bias occurs because the association between the variables at the group level does not necessarily represent an association existing at the individual level. So here's an example of an ecological fallacy. And what this has to do is, let's say you were curious about the lack of skilled birth attendants as an explanation for delivery outcomes. So if we look over here on this side, Europe, the Americas, Western Pacific without China, we see the percentage of birth without skilled attendants. It's really low. And we also see the maternal and neonatal mortality rates, also low compared to the rest of the world. So you might say, oh, okay, having more skilled attendants contributes to lower neonatal mortality and lower maternal mortality rates. And then we see Eastern Mediterranean region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. We see these areas, these locations have a greater percentage of birth without skilled attendants. So you might suspect that that is a reason why there is a much greater maternal and neonatal death rate per 10,000 live births. But here's where the bias or the fallacy potentially comes in, and there's always potential other explanations that would require additional analysis. In this location here, you have a lower death rate, even though you have a very high percentage of births. If we look at Southeast Asia and Africa, it skyrockets up. So even though Africa is similar to, see here, Southeast Asia without India, even though these two locations are similar in the percentage of births without a skilled attendant, Africa is way higher compared to here. So what would be the reason why this is so much higher? And again, cross-sectional studies we discussed in the prior lecture. It's a measure of the prevalence of disease or injury, typically at a point in time, and we can have cross-sectional studies that are serial in nature. Now, coming back here again, hopefully I didn't misspeak. Hopefully I said correlational studies. So going back here, correlational, not necessarily the same as cross-sectional. So these ecological studies are correlational. So if I misspoke, again, I apologize for that. Cross-sectional is what we're talking about now. As we continue on, cross-sectional, we had talked about in the prior lecture, the example, the steroid use and that change over time. We talked about how cross-sectional are important for planning health services. They are giving us an idea about what to expect in clinical situations. Again, though, weak evidence for cause and effect. Now let's continue on with some other observational studies. Case control. Case control studies are very important in medicine. We'll see the value of cohort studies in a bit. Cohort studies, I think, are a little bit higher. No, I know they're a little bit higher on the hierarchy of evidence than case control studies. But case control studies sometimes are the highest level of evidence that we can access based upon ethical reasons. Okay? So, case control studies provide a relatively cheap way to investigate causes of disease or injury, especially rare diseases. If you recall, in a cohort study, you may not be able to capture enough people that have a rare condition, or you may have to wait forever for an occurrence to occur. If you don't have the money of a Framingham study, but you want to know what the risks are for a particular cancer, then a case control study is your way. Also, a cross-sectional study may not help you capture the presence of a rare disease. And again, cross-sectional are only weak evidence for causality. So what you do in a case control study, and I've got a picture coming up in a bit which kind of lays this out. I know there's a lot of words here. Basically, you've got a group that have it, those are the cases, and a group that don't, that are similar in nature demographically. Those are the controls. And then what you want to do is retrospectively go back and look at potential risk factors to see if there's a difference in proportion of those risk factors between groups. It's important you know who your cases are. Cases are selected on the disease presence and not exposure. Controls are people without the disease. So here's the cases. Here are the controls. Let's say you are a physician assistant working with a medical team. Maybe you're up at OHSU and you are working with a rare form of cancer. So you've got individuals with the cancer. As we'll see, as we talked about, cohort studies aren't the way to go for a lot of reasons. You could walk across the hall, find a group of similar aged individuals, similar biologic sex, et cetera, and you could, as long as those people did not have the cases, go back in time and find out potential exposure to see if exposure to chemicals, smoking, particular areas of the country one might live in, et cetera, increases the risk of developing that form of cancer. Why case control studies are so valuable is we can't ethically put somebody at risk. We can't say, hey, let's see how bad smoking is by having you start a smoking habit. Or we can't see how bad potentially vaping is by having teenagers start a vaping habit. But if we see people with lung conditions, we can go back in time and look and see between those individuals, hey, did you start a vaping habit when you were younger? Versus the controls. Did the controls have a vaping habit? We can see if that exposure is greater. So here's some examples. Case control example, researchers in Papua New Guinea compared the history of meat consumption in people who had enteritis necroticans. Probably pronounced that incorrectly. It's not a disease I treat, so sue me. Sorry about that. So we're looking at history of meat consumption in those people that had the disease with people that did not. Proportionally, more people had the disease who reported prior meat consumption than those who were not affected. How did they find out this information? They interviewed subjects. Another example, looking at the relationship between thalidomide and limb defects in babies born in Germany. Study compared the effect of children with normal children. Of the 46 mothers whose babies had a malformation, 41 had been given thalidomide during weeks 4 and 9 of their pregnancy. None of the 300 mothers in the control group had taken the drug. So it showed thalidomide was the problem. This is the power of the case control study. End of story. Thalidomide's done at that point. You would not then go, oh, we've got to prove it with a prospective cohort study and randomize women that we give thalidomide to because the risk would be too great for the babies. Now, the cohort studies, incident studies, these are where we begin with people who are disease-free. And then we're going to classify them or categorize them or discriminate them into one of two groups based upon potential exposures. Prospective cohort studies are a major undertaking of time. They require a lot of money, a lot of resources. I've done several of these, but mine have not been as exhaustive as a Framingham type of study. I have looked at injury in sports populations, so over a course of a 4 or 6 month period. But what about if I wanted to know about the onset of leukemia after exposure to radiation? How long would I have to observe people for? What challenges would I have? What kind of support staff would I need? Obviously, a prospective cohort study is going to give me very valuable information, but what if I lose track of people over time? What if they move? How about the financial aspect of paying for testing, et cetera, et cetera? Major, major undertakings. Here's what a cohort study looks like, at least a prospective cohort study. Okay, we've got a population that we draw some people from, people without the disease at baseline. Then we categorize them into an exposure or a not exposed group. Or I might like to even call it an at-risk group and a lesser risk group. And then we look to see who develops the disease or injury. So another breakdown of it here. Study I did, 106 Division III female athletes without injury at baseline at the start of the season. And I put them through a series of sport-specific functional tests, things like jumping for distance with both legs, single leg hops, an agility drill. And so the group that I put as at risk were those who had below average scores on all functional tests. And then everybody else, whether they had above average scores or even 3 tests below average. And then I followed them forward in time to see the proportions. And what I found is in this particular study that this group here, who had lower scores, were at a 9 times greater risk of experiencing a non-contact time loss injury during the season at their thigh or knee. Studies can be prospective or retrospective, these cohort studies. Prospective one I just gave the examples of there where we are following people forward in time. Retrospective is historical in nature, and these are where people utilize large data sets. As I talked about in part 1, the Framingham study is prospective. We saw all this information before. Prospective ones are great because what you do is it's planned. Prospective is planned. You're able to think about everything you want to collect ahead of time. Retrospective are very advantageous. They take less time, they're less expensive, much easier to perform. I was at a conference. I was presenting a thematic poster at an American College of Sports Medicine conference. I was very proud of my poster that had 82 subjects. Everybody else in this group that we were presenting all at the same time had thousands of people. Those individuals, those researchers, hadn't collected that data. They were individuals accessing medical databases. So they can be less expensive, take less time, easy to perform. But here's the key thing. You may miss something if you didn't collect that information at the start. There may be something key that you missed. And there's the possibility of bias if data was not collected in a standardized way. But nowadays, that's probably a minimal disadvantage just because of how medical databases are maintained. Does this look like a prospective cohort study to you? It is, except this is a retrospective. Start here in the present. In the present, you know that there is disease and no disease. You don't know what the proportions are yet, but in the present, you've got people with the disease or no disease. What you do with a medical registry is you go back to the past and you then categorize them or you discriminate them into one of 2 groups. So my example here is as a physical therapist, let's say I work at a skilled nursing facility or a skilled nursing home, and there's a lot of people having fall injuries. So we're worried about breaking hips, things like that. I don't know these proportions yet. What I know is there are 70 people that have had falls. I can go back in time and look at any data that we collected when people were admitted. And here, one of the data points was individuals with poor ankle stability, so poor balance. So we had people with good balance and people with poor balance based upon their ankle measures. And we see that now I can go forward and I can see where people fall. 60% of the people with poor ankle stability had a fall, whereas only 10% here. So this illustrates then by using this retrospective cohort that this is definitely a major factor of concern. Not going to read through these, but this, if you want to read through them, you can do so. This information may be helpful for you. It may not. Basically, you're looking at advantages and disadvantages of the two different approaches. One thing I want to highlight here is retrospective and case control are both historical, but they're not the same. Because the key difference is the case control, you've got cases and controls, where the retrospective, they all are from the same cohort. And another thing I want to highlight here is with a prospective cohort study and a retrospective, the relative risk statistic is used. Sometimes you'll see people also use an odds ratio. Key thing though with the case control study, only the odds ratio statistic is used. This is a nice way to think about the discovery of risk. Prospective, P, planned, it goes into the future. Same thing with clinical trials. Retrospective and case controlled, we're looking into the past. And these next few slides are summaries of the strengths of different epidemiologic studies and what they're good for. I'm not going to read through these. These are for your reference. If you come across a particular paper that you want to take a look at, you can. You can come back to these slides here and look and see what the advantages and disadvantages are. Now, let's talk about experimental studies, because I imagine some of these will be, there might potentially be some of these within your medical-based research. And in an experimental study design, and we'll talk a lot more about experimental designs in the coming weeks, but in experimental study designs, we can have epidemiologic components. You can have randomized controlled trials using patients as subjects. You can have field trials in which participants are healthy people, and then community trials in which the participants are the communities themselves. So, experimental epi, you start an intervention, or you have an intervention and you are trying to see if that helps the population. So, for example, the elimination of a dietary factor thought to cause an allergy, or testing a new treatment on a selected group of patients. You can randomize people into your experimental group and into your control group and look to see what the risk reduction was. How much better was the experimental group? Because you can have both a positive outcome, like there was statistically better outcomes in blood pressure or better outcomes in cholesterol levels, something like that. But you can also look to see if the risk of developing a disease was decreased, that risk reduction. So again, this kind of explains just what I talked about there, where we're using randomized control trial to evaluate that. And again, this is with patients as subjects. The field trial, this is where we're using healthy individuals. Again, I won't read through all of these things here, but here's the example. This is a nice kind of sports example. This is from big time research published in 1999 that really has influenced a lot of things related to sports practices. You've got a population and you randomize them into a preventative group and a no intervention group. So these are all healthy individuals, and then you're looking to see about disease or injury incident. And if we go to 1999, this study here, Tim Hewitt et al., looking at ACL injury risk. So what they did is they had three groups. They had males who they didn't do anything different to their training program, and then they had two groups of females. One group of females, they had performed the neuromuscular training program, and they had another group of females that they didn't do any intervention with. So these are all athletes. You had basically two control groups, a male group and a female group, and then a female experimental group. And what did they find is they found that the females in the experimental group had a risk reduction. So in this study here, we see that how do they use epidemiologic data? Untrained female athletes had a 3.6 times higher incidence of knee injury than the trained female athletes. And those untrained were almost 5 times more likely to get injured than males. And they go on to say that the trained females had basically the same risk as their male counterparts. So this is epidemiologic in nature. You'll also find things in there, again, incidence information. So you'll find stuff like this in your paper. And here they're describing the different injuries. So I highlight these not for you to know the study per se, but just to know that, like, if you look at a paper, you're going to see things like that. That's epidemiology in action. Community trial here, we're almost done with things. This is the treatment groups, they're communities rather than individuals. These are appropriate for diseases that are influenced by social conditions and for which prevention efforts target group behavior. So I won't read through this one, but you can go ahead and do so. So this is a community intervention trial that falls under the experimental epidemiology umbrella. All right. Hopefully that's helpful. Spent about 31 minutes here going over things. I know it's a lot of stuff to cram into a short time period. Um, love to talk with you more about how anything that you find could be incorporated into your paper.